Welcome back to the Church Law Podcast. My name is Erika Cole, and I'm happy to be your podcast host. We've been on this amazing series discussing the life cycle of a church. And today, I'm especially excited about our topic. I know I say that every time, but I really mean it. Today, we're going to be talking about endings and new beginnings. And I have heard from some of you that you are especially ready to hear about this because you find your church in this spot. This entire season has been dedicated to how churches begin, go around the life cycle of growth and perhaps seasons of change and maybe even seasons of decrease. And then the reality where you might be considering, is this the end for us? I just want to encourage you today that if you're coming to the end, we believe that the end is also a place for new beginnings. From my over 25 years of representing denominations and churches, this circle is real. It's a life cycle. And I don't want to break out in the Lion King song, but it's the circle of life. Today, I'm thrilled to have on the Church Law Podcast, Matt McGee. He is a fellow podcaster who loves the church and its people. He specifically explores the narratives of American churches that have closed, consolidated, or merged. I'll briefly share his bio. So, Matt McGee is an experienced nonprofit leader with expertise in donor-centered fundraising and strategic planning. He's held key roles at Bethany Christian Services and Reach for Excellence and earned his master's in independent and charter school leadership from Mercer University. Matt and his family actively serve at North Metro Church in Marietta, Georgia. Transitioning from a music teacher to nonprofit work, he has focused on improving the lives of disadvantaged families. Currently, he champions House of Cherith, a faith-based nonprofit in Atlanta dedicated to supporting survivors of sex trafficking. Welcome to the Church Law Podcast, Matt.
Well, thank you so much, Erika. It's so great to see you again. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm so glad you're here. And
Yeah.
in some ways, while this is a brand new discussion for my listeners, some of them may have heard the interview that I got to have on your podcast some months ago. So I'll make sure I pop that in the show notes. But I'm so glad you're here as we're having this important discussion. So I'm going to just start right from the beginning, just sharing how much I love your podcast, which is called the Last Service Podcast, where you explore the narratives of churches that have closed, but you say it isn't a tale of despair, but it's a celebration of good endings, enduring legacies, and the courage to embrace new beginnings. Before we get to the celebration part, why do you think the idea of a church closure seems to be so morbid to many?
Yeah, I think two things. First of all, uh, culturally, we like to build organizations. I think that's just in who we are in America, and it's a good thing. We don't like to think about when those organizations aren't as successful as we wanted them to be. Culturally, within American Christianity, we tend to see ourselves as God's representatives in the world. So, which is true and a good thing again. But there's kind of this sense that it's our church versus and God versus the world, our church plus God versus the world. And there's a part of that that's wonderful. But what happens when it doesn't work out, right? Well, we know it wasn't God's fault, but we don't want to think about it being our fault. But what happened to God's promises? And then you get into this negative spiritual cycle of we just don't know how to approach it. We haven't had a lot of language. And then on a completely different level, it's just sad when relationships end, right? There's something in our human nature that wants to tie meaning to places and spaces. It's just how God made us. It's apparent in all of human history, right? The concept of a sacred space is there in every single culture. So what I want to know, there's a part of me deep down that wants to know that where all of these meaningful things happened, my marriage, my kids' baptism, those beautiful discussions I had when we were going through a hard time, or a friend was going through a hard time, all of those wonderful celebratory and sad moments that were so meaningful, we want them to last forever, as
Mhm.
if it was Eden or the promised land or heaven. And it's painful to remember that Earth is temporary. Everything
Yeah.
here is going to pass. So I think that's part of where the morbidity comes from.
Yeah. No, that's so powerful that you say, on the one hand, it's a place that's representative of these bigger experiences that we've had in life, right?
Right.
On the other hand, while when we step from outside that church building or that facility, we're still on earth. And so on earth, things are imperfect and we
Right.
don't have to assign blame. Sometimes the end happens and it is a reflection of next things. So I'm curious, do you have a
Mhm.
personal experience with church closure? I know that you interview lots of folks on your podcast, but is this a part from a personal experience at all?
No, I haven't. I've sort of been on the fringes of a couple of churches that looked like they were coming close to the brink, and that got me curious. But I did close and merge a nonprofit, and I think, and it was a faith-based Christian nonprofit. I think there's some parallels there. There was definitely grappling with the sense of failure, the failure of this mission that God entrusted us, that we believe we were called to. To be honest, I still wrestle with that a little bit. There was a a well-meaning and justifiably frustrated and angry person when that nonprofit was wrapping up, and I can give this person a lot of grace now. But they said if God was in this, it wouldn't have failed, and
Mm,
that hit hard. Um, and there was a part of me that had to wrestle with whether or not that's true, and there was a part of me that just said, "No, I know that's not true. I don't
mhm.
think that's right. I don't think that's the way to look at this." I think that God gives us grace to do the work that we're called to do, and He gives us grace and forgiveness when we mess that work up, right? And when you can assign blame,
Yeah.
we're still forgiven, we're still loved, God's still with us. And then other times, in that organization, I mean, it's just simple. Like our overhead was just way too high. It got too high, and we couldn't sustain it with revenue. And I mean, there was a level that was just purely economic, and
Yeah.
no one's to blame for that. And God's still with us and forgives us and loves us. And it doesn't change for 1 second. It doesn't change all of the beautiful moments of healing, all of the moments that we were able to share the love of Jesus through that work. Doesn't change any of that. The ending doesn't change what happened
And I
along
think
the way.
sometimes we are a little short-sighted on when the end is. Because the
Yeah.
truth is, I mean, having walked through a journey of starting a company, merging my earlier firm, and then having the offshoot of something brand new, recreating something new, I've literally walked through this cycle on a personal level. And I remember saying
Mhm.
to my husband after 12 years of running my earlier firm, like, I failed. And he was like, "What?" Like, how do you say that?
Yeah.
Because you've touched all these people, you've expanded, opportunities for so many others. You
Yeah.
have bought this important message and done this important work, and then you combined it to this other and it took time for me to be able to really see that success can look different. I'm giving air quotes here for, folks
Yeah.
can see on YouTube, but on podcasters, I'm giving air quotes on success because sometimes we have in our minds what success is supposed to look like. And really, God has the vision. God has the broader vision. God has the vision not only for now, but also for the future. And He knows the end from the beginning. And so it's just us being able to rest in the fact that if this work is complete, there's a difference between something um maybe stopping, which I think is the part we focus on, versus something being complete. Like Jesus, he completed his work on earth.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody would say, "Oh, he messed up," right?
Right.
He died at 33, right? That seems pretty abrupt, but no, he completed his work. And
Yeah.
sometimes I think it's important for us to rest in the completion of our work. And so I think that's a part of what I'm hoping people will take away
Yeah.
from this lifestyle of church as we consider it. So I want to come back to what I mentioned in the opening. I
Yeah.
got an email from a listener who really resonated with this whole series, but could readily identify. He said, I believe that my church is in the latter category of coming to an ending.
Okay.
So I would love to hear you speak to that listener and listeners like that when they're battling with whether they should consider closure. What is it that you would want them to examine?
Yeah, that is a great question. There's not really there's no quick, simple answer. But there are some key indicators. You need to take an honest look at your finances. You need to take an honest look at your attendance, an unbiased look at your attendance, and give yourself and your church leadership space to have some brutal honesty about that. I'm a big fan of Dr. Gramberg's Quick 50 assessment. And I would love for somebody to poke holes in this, but I can't find a way where this isn't true. If your church is over 50 years old, I would say, let's say your building is 50 years old. If your church has 50 or fewer in attendance, average, and if the average age of those attendees is over 50, in other words, approaching empty nesters, you need to think about the end. Whether it feels like it or not, whether you have a lot of money in the bank, it's time to think about what could transition this church into becoming something new or handing off our resources to another generation or another culture that could minister better. Does that make sense?
It
Those
does. And
metrics?
I
Yeah.
actually listened to the episode where you had him on and
Yeah.
you talked about that. And I, of course, given my work in this arena, also thought about like, what does that say? Like
Yeah.
the 350s, as I recall, is you have less than 50 congregation
Mhm.
members. Your facility is over 50 years old, and the members that are there in general are over the age of 50. So I thought that was very interesting. And I do think the point is it's a simple kind of, finger to the wind kind of
Right.
test to just say, let's see if we find ourselves here. I think what I would want to offer from that
Mhm.
end is where is this information from a relative perspective, right?
Mhm.
Forget the building age. But when you talk about the membership, the amount
Yeah.
of people that you see on a regular basis, and the age of people, I think I would want to see what's the trajectory. Because
Yeah.
what I often find is, there's these things tend to be movable, right?
Mhm.
So, how many people you see? This is the way I ask the question. How many people do you see in general on a weekend? How many people do you see on a Sunday?
Right.
And we're not talking about like Easter and Mother's Day, et cetera, right? Just on an
Yeah.
average Sunday.
Yeah.
And then is that number growing? Is it going up or is it going down? And obviously people in general are aging, but are we bringing in younger people or is that not happening?
Yeah.
Is there activity within the community or do people know that you're there? Is there some impacts within the community? Those are the kinds of things I would want to add to that assessment, but I love it as just a
Yeah.
general matter. And you specifically mentioned economics,
Yeah.
wanting to have people take a look at where they are economically. So, what economic challenges do churches face today that
Yeah.
might lead to closures? Like, what economically would people see? How would they be able to identify, to notice that they may be in this category of maybe I don't even want to say thinking about closure, but thinking about the sustainability of remaining open.
Sure. So much about this has to do with the building itself. So, a metric that is widely shared, if more than 50% of your budget is going to maintain a building, you need to think about what to do with that building because that's not a sustainable model. You're propping up a building that's getting harder and harder to maintain. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The way that we built buildings 20, 30, 50 years ago, well, 30, 40, 50 years ago, is just not very flexible. There are these big, huge buildings they kind of just do one thing. So think about how the amount you're spending fixing your building is limiting your capacity to do ministry. Now, I would also throw into that, is your budget, are your financial priorities maintaining programs that are based on past memories that are successful? In other words, are you propping up an older model of ministry that worked 30 years ago and it was amazing and you have beautiful memories from that and you're just trying to fuel and recreate that? That one's harder to place. As opposed to, is your finance centered around creating disciples within your local community? And when we see creating disciples in a local community, we start to get out of buildings a lot more. People do start to come in more. You start to get more young families, things like that. Another economic factor, I don't have any proof of this, but this is just a strong hunch based on my experience in nonprofits. I was actually on a bike ride out in the country recently, and I kept passing these, small, beautiful small churches that held 100 people, and it hit me. I bet the cost of hiring a full-time minister back in the 60s and 70s didn't cost as much as it does today. And it's possible that a 100-person church could sustain a full-time pastor. Now that's a tough order. It's just the cost of living increases. It's pure economics, which is why we see sort of the conglomeration into mega churches, right? Because you put all of those resources together and you have thousands of people, and now we can afford a lot of staff that can do a lot of things. And within that, they're sort of ministering to pockets of about 100 people, right? 50 to 100 people per person. So there's just some cost of living things that affect that, along with the cost of maintaining buildings that age.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. The facility cost, I think, is real. I ran into an issue at the church recently that wanted some insights around the fact that they had been really delaying maintenance.
Yeah.
And these delayed maintenance costs just continue to increase while the size of the congregation was continuing to go down.
Mhm.
And even if you own the facility, i.e., you don't have a mortgage, which isn't true of a lot of churches, but
It's
there are
true. Yeah.
some. So even if there's not a mortgage, that maintenance component is really a big deal.
Yeah.
And even that can run into issues of insurance. I've been seeing a lot of problems around that when you have these ongoing maintenance issues that don't happen. And then insurance carriers will often say, well, we're not going to be able to cover you until and unless you replace the roof, for example, which may be $80,000 and the church just
Right.
doesn't have it, right? So it just really becomes
Yeah.
this downward spiral. So that's a
Yeah.
real issue. And your staffing, right? So being able to hire and have people there who can engage and actually commit to doing the work. We know that churches are really run in large part by volunteers, but there certainly comes a part where having dedicated staff is critical. And if your church can't quite sustain that, I do think it is a part of thinking through, have we come to a
Yeah.
place where we need to transition? So using that word transition, if I can ask you this,
Yeah.
how can congregations navigate the transition when they've done this assessment, right? They've
Mhm.
looked at the quick 50, they've assessed their financial
Yeah.
situation, they've assessed really where they are related to building maintenance and costs, and maybe are starting to come to the conclusion that this is no longer sustainable. Um, what happens from there? What does this transition look like in your experience?
Yeah. So I think what's needed most is actually pastoral care. Um, and I say that to say, once you've made the leap to realize, take a look at reality and accurately assess that we're probably not going to be able to rejuvenate this church in its current format. We're going to have to make some either very extreme changes, or it's time to transition these resources to another group. The next barrier from the stories that I've heard and told tend to really be spiritual and emotional. And you can tell in the more successful stories the elements of pastoral care that were put in place. The less successful stories, the people just talk all about logistics, right? It's it's tricky because the logistics are obviously very important, but they're not that hard in the long run. I mean, it is difficult to wind down a business and to close a nonprofit and to transfer assets, but it's not that hard. And especially when you bring in third-party counsel to help you do it. But really what's needed is to provide space for the grief, the healing, to work through that sense of failure, to honor the good memories. And I think what is crucial and often gets overlooked is to shepherd your congregants to their next church home. I've told some really powerful stories about pastors who made that a priority. And then suddenly all of the wind down becomes joyful and it becomes happy. And there's tears, but there's celebration in that. And the stress level goes down. And the absolute most important thing, people walk out the door maintaining relationships instead of saying, I don't want to ever go back to a church again. I was so hurt by this, I'm never going to be involved anywhere else. And that's just the worst tragedy, I think, is when that happens. We end with pain and failure as opposed to ending with people loving each other. So pastoral care, pastoral care, pastoral care. Unfortunately, we live in the era of the church growth movements, and there's a lot of great things that has produced. But I worry that because we become so focused on revitalization, so focused on growing large crowds for organizations, all for good reasons and all to spread the gospel, we've sort of lost that pastoral care language to talk about grief and failure. And we're people of the resurrection. We're people who believe in eternal life. Like we need to be able to do this really well.
Yeah, this is so good, Matt. So, obviously, I'm an attorney, so I'm able to, I see these from both angles as a
Right.
church attorney, right? So I see the pastoral care component as so completely critical, and I want to talk about when I've walked churches through this process, how important it is that they have clarity on what this wind down looks like. So I
Sure.
do want to just pop in just some of the legal assessment that I
Yeah.
want churches to consider. And we call this from a legal standpoint dissolution. So you may have heard that term, but to dissolve or the dissolution process. And literally most states, if you sort of consider what it looks like to start an entity, it's really just the other side of that same coin. So usually you're going to incorporate in the state. And so likewise, on the other side of the coin, you will file articles of dissolution in the state where you were formed. So it's dissolving that legal entity, but timing is everything. You don't want to dissolve before you actually go through the process of making sure that there's a strategy, that you have a plan. So you really pull the legal trigger after you have completed what Matt is talking about, making sure that from a pastoral perspective, there's a plan, that people are accounted for as the sheep, and making sure that the flock is well accounted for. But you're going to file articles of dissolution, and then you're going to make sure that you close out the employer identification number, which we will call cancellation. So you're going to cancel the employer identification number with the IRS. Likewise, cancel the tax exempt status with the Internal Revenue Service. And you're going to make sure that you transition all of your assets. So that's bank accounts, that's any buildings that are owned, any assets into another tax exempt organization. That is a requirement of the Internal Revenue Service. So think about those 4 steps. Now, again, timing is everything. You don't just jump off the guard to do this right away. This is going to be a part of a larger process. So as we are wrapping up here, Matt, I want to ask you, can you share with the audience any stories of resilience, where
Oh yeah.
that's what you do. I feel like that's what your
Yeah.
podcast specializes in, telling this story. I mean, I've listened to any number of episodes. It's not that we don't talk about the real nature of the challenges of this, but there are
Yeah.
beautiful stories of resilience. And can you share
Yeah.
some examples of churches that have successfully transformed to their next mission after facing closure?
Yeah. One of the first ones that comes to mind is a church I had some personal experience at, and that was Ballast Point Baptist down in Tampa, Florida. The theme, I talked with Pastor Tom. The theme that he kept coming back to is non-desperate decision making. Through a series of bad sort of pastoral transitions and just some other decline, he got ahead of the problem and realized that they were going to have a hard time turning things around. They were quickly going to be in some financial straits. So he reached out for help before it was an emergency and was able to negotiate a pretty successful merger. They legally, it was even a little more complicated than just sort of one ended and another one came in, but a lot of the same people stayed. There's still a church in that same building on that same plot of land. And Tom, who started there before the merger, baptized his grandson there just days after he retired from the new church they merged
Mm,
into. And I think that's just a beautiful story of
yeah.
excellent, humble leadership and pooling of resources. Another one I really like is the Dinner Church Collaborative. Um, this is a church out on the West Coast. They saw a decline coming. They were having a hard time reaching the neighborhood, and through just a series of long prayer meetings and wrestling with their future, they came up with this wonderfully simple idea of we're going to have a meal. This is not like a shelter meal where we're ladling out bad soup and stuff. No, this is going to be a nice meal, but anybody can come to it, and we're going to tell stories about Jesus. And a ton of people came, and they still come, and they've launched multiple dinner churches around their city. They've launched dinner church as a way to revitalize churches throughout the country. And man, isn't there a part of that that just sounds pretty great? Like a meal and talking about Jesus. Like that
Yeah.
sounds pretty
Sounds kind
great,
of familiar.
actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
I love
does.
it.
I haven't released this episode yet, but I believe it's First Presbyterian Miami. They were down to 12 members and $19 million in debt, but got very creative with their use of property. Were able to sell off a portion of it that got developed that they have access to use, but they were able to retain some profit from that, eliminate their debt. The pastor's theme that he kept sharing was no drama. We're just not going to
Mm,
have drama in our church. We don't do that. So by by setting that tone, it eliminated a lot of the fighting, which then started producing growth. And now they're able to minister to their city in new ways. And then
I
two
got to
merge.
tell you,
Yeah, go ahead.
well, I'll just say I love the idea of church mergers.
Yeah,
And I have a guide on that. I'll pop that in the show notes. But
yeah,
I I've shared, and this is something also that Church Law and Tax has done, glue around the reality of mergers are something that well known in the for-profit arena, but we are seeing that on the increase, very much so. And as we move
yeah,
toward 2025, I want churches to really have this on their horizon. It
yeah,
can be a fantastic way for a church that's looking for a facility, to come together, maybe with a church that has a facility but less attendance, bringing together resources, maybe expanding into a new geographic area where you're feeling God's wanting you to plant or be involved. A merger can
yeah,
be a great way to meet that need and that desire as well. Or whether we're talking consolidation. I mean, these are all more or less legal terms, but it's really a
yeah,
matter where the form sort of follows the substance. When you come together and strategize and make a commitment that we're going to put kingdom before everything else, I find that God gives the insights and provides the needed resources. And so I'm
yeah.
so glad that we've been able to have this conversation.
Yeah.
I love the work that you do. I'm
Thank
glad
you.
that we're able to discuss really the insights that you share on your podcast, the Last Service podcast. So thank you so much, Matt. Do you want to have any final words before we close?
I think I'll end with what one of my guests recently said: good endings look like people loving each other. And I might add to that by saying what you just said, which is let's find the best use for Kingdom assets. And those are things to celebrate, even amidst the pain of what might be a closure.
That's so good. Thank you. Thank you for those
Thank you so
final
much,
words.
Erika.
Have a
All
great rest of
right.
the day.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye bye.